Good afternoon, and welcome to another Native Drums. I'm Napoleon Bradford, and I'm so excited to be with you today. There's a question I want you to ask today. In fact, I probably should have given you the title of today, which is What's Often Forgotten About Freedom. Let me go ahead and write it so you can see it. What's often forgotten about freedom, especially on the 4th? Hold on. Let me give it to you. It's so amazing as we just recently celebrated the 4th of July, right? And so I think it's only fitting that we focus on this topic just a little bit. What's often forgotten about our freedom on the 4th? I'm so grateful for this opportunity. And I just ask that you lean in for a minute. There's a question I want to ask you today. When did you become free? Think about it for a moment. Most Americans have an answer. July 4th, 1776. That's the answer we learned in school. That's the answer wrapped in fireworks, flags, parades, cookouts, patriotic music, red, white, and blue. But what if I told you that for millions of Americans, the answer has never been fully true? Not historically, not legally, not socially. And for many people, not even today, because freedom depends on one very important question. Freedom from who? From whom? I wrote a blog on July 5th or in July of 2020 titled What's Often Forgotten About the Freedom of the 4th. And I opened that piece with Frederick Douglass's haunting question. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? In fact, that question was posed on July 5th of 1852, 174 years ago. Frederick Douglass asked, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? And that question still echoes. Not because we hate America, not because we're ungrateful, not because we do not understand citizenship, but because some of us know that the loudest celebrations often cover the deepest contradictions. So today on the Native Drum, I want us to talk about what's often forgotten about freedom. And I want to talk about the good of God talk in turbulent times. Because if we're going to talk about freedom, we have to talk about memory. If we're going to talk about America, we have to talk about truth. If we're going to talk about the 4th of July, we have to tell the whole story. So let me begin where I began in 2020. I am a proud American citizen. I am an Army chaplain. I believe in everything good about this country. But as a citizen, I must also exercise my right to point out the obvious sins of this country. James Baldwin said, I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for this reason, I reserve the right to criticize her perpetually. It's not hatred. That's responsibility. It's not bitterness. It's prophetic citizenship. Because love cannot tell the truth. Love that cannot tell the truth is not love. It's performance. And too much of what America calls patriotism is really performance. Real love tells the truth. Real love remembers. Real love refuses to allow celebration to become erasure. So let's remember. In 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia. Now, let me say this. They weren't the first Africans to arrive, but they were the first enslaved Africans to arrive. And by 1776, this land was already 157 years into the process of slavery. 157 years. Before the Declaration of Independence, before fireworks, before patriotic speeches, before we hold these truths to be self-evident, before the flag became sacred in the imagination of the nation, Black bodies had already been laboring, suffering, building, nursing, harvesting, bleeding, and dying on this soil. And when those white men with the white wigs and black slaves gathered to craft the Declaration of Independence and wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," they did not mean us. They did not consider us worthy of the same life, liberty, and pursuit of property, subsequently happiness, that they wrote about. That's not opinion, that's history. The enslaved were not included in the promise of American freedom. And years later, 250 years later, many people still do not see us as qualified, as worthy, as more than the slaves we were at the signing of this document. And when Black people were considered, it was often not for dignity, not for equality or humanity, but for political math, for representation, for power. The Constitution counted enslaved persons as 3/5 human for representation. Not because they believed we were almost human, but because they wanted more political power while denying our full personhood. Right? So for every 5 slaves, they would get 3 votes. So in 1776, we were not free. In 1789, we were not free. And even the Emancipation Proclamation was not simply the moral awakening of America. It was also a military strategy. It was designed to disrupt the Confederacy. It was designed to strengthen the Union while not setting free the slaves that were contained in the Union states. It allowed Black bodies to become useful to the war effort, but still not have voting rights. So whether you point to January 1st, 1863 or June 19th, 1865, we were still not fully free. We may have been called free, but that freedom still had shackles placed on it by those in power. Let me just say this, right? I need you to understand what I'm saying. That means in September of 1862, when Abraham Lincoln drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, to January 1st, 1863, when it became law, and even on June 19, 1865, right? The reality is, at all those points, all slaves were not free. I just need you to understand that, right? The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime. That word matters. Except, one word, one exception, one loophole, and that loophole helped create convict leasing, chain gangs, forced prison labor, mass incarceration, and the criminalization of Black life. Sometimes history doesn't repeat itself. Sometimes history simply changes clothes. Then came the 14th Amendment. And here's something I don't think we spend enough time thinking about. Imagine being born in America, working in America, building America, fighting for America, dying in America, and the government still having to debate whether you belong here. That was the 14th Amendment. It was not merely about citizenship, it was about recognition. It was America finally being forced to admit that Black people were citizens. And that matters right now, because in June, this last month, the Supreme Court rejected an attempt to restrict birthright citizenship and upheld the constitutional guarantee that nearly all people born on U.S. soil are citizens under the 14th Amendment. Think about that. In 2026, we are still arguing about who belongs. History has a strange way of introducing itself as breaking news. Birthright citizenship is not just an immigration issue. It is a Reconstruction issue. It's a Dred Scott issue. It's a question of whether America will honor the promises it was forced to make after the sins it committed. Then came the 15th Amendment. Black men were given the right to vote. But even that did not settle freedom, because every time Black people gained a right, this country found a way to restrict its use. Poll tax, literary test, grandfather clauses, white primaries, terror, lynchings, Black code, Jim Crow, segregation, Ku Klux Klan, Plessy versus Ferguson, all reminders that this country never fully desired us to be free or equal. And now here we are again. In April 2026, the Supreme Court decided Louisiana versus Cayales, a redistricting case involving Louisiana's congressional map and Black voting power. The court struck down a map that had created a second majority Black district, and civil rights advocates warned that the decision weakened Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So again, I ask, what is freedom if citizenship is contested? What is freedom if voting power is diluted? What is freedom if representation can be manipulated? What is freedom if every generation has to refight battles under new legal language? That's why the 4th of July hits differently, especially for me. For some people, the 4th is a celebration. For us, it's interrogation. Who is free? Who was excluded? Who was counted? Who was erased? Who had to wait? Who had to bleed? Who had to march? Who had to sue? Who had to organize? Who had to pray through tears? In 2020, I wrote that not much had changed. Now, in 2026, I think the truth is even sharper. Some things changed, but many things changed back. Corporations made promises after George Floyd. Institutions released statements. Churches held panels. Businesses posted Black squares. But 6 years later, many of the commitments to diversity, equity, inclusion, police reform, voting access, and racial repair have been weakened, abandoned, politicized, or reversed. So maybe America did not have a racial reckoning. Maybe America had a racial reaction. And here's the deeper issue. America loves the language of freedom, but America often resists the redistribution of power that real freedom requires. Pulling down a statue is one thing. Changing laws is another. Posting a statement is one thing. Changing budgets is another. Celebrating Juneteenth is one thing. Repairing slavery, redlining, voter suppression, medical racism, food apartheid, educational inequity, and mass incarceration is another. But this is where I struggle with the word reconciliation, because reconciliation means the restoration of friendly relations. It's to reconcile, right? To come back to where we were. The other definition of reconciliation is making one view or belief compatible with another. And maybe that has been the problem the whole time. We've been taught to believe that the oppressor wants what is best for the oppressed. The master really wants us free. That if we behave well enough, wait long enough, speak politely enough, pray quietly enough, and show enough gratitude, the system will finally love us. But how can an oppressor who benefits from oppression be trusted to define liberation? Woo, let me say that again. How can an oppressor who benefits from oppression be trusted to define liberation? This is why God talk matters, because real God talk breaks the spell. Real God talk reminds us that Pharaoh does not get to define freedom. Caesar does not get to define justice. Empire does not get to define peace. And America does not get to define the full humanity of Black people. God already did that. Genesis says we are made in the image of God. Jeremiah says God knew us before God formed us and still formed us. Luke said the Spirit of the Lord is upon Jesus to preach the good news to the poor, release the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, freedom to the oppressed. The good God talk in turbulent times is that it gives us a deeper memory than America's memory. America remembers us as labor. God remembers us as image. America may remember us as property. God remembers us as beloved. America may remember us as 3/5. God remembers us as whole. America may remember us through census, law, prison, policy, and policing. God remembers us through covenant, creation, calling, and promise. That is why I still believe in the power of faith. Not faith that makes us passive, not faith that tells us to be quiet, not faith that blesses oppression, not faith that tells Black people to wait for heaven while catching hell on earth. I'm talking about liberating faith, a faith that tells the truth, a faith that remembers the ancestors, a faith that validates lived experience, a faith that looks at suffering and says, this is real, but it is not ultimate. That is the good of God talk. It refuses to let oppression have the final word. James Cone taught us that that the cross and the lynching tree belong in the same conversation. Kelly Brown Douglas reminds us that resurrection hope is not denial. Resurrection hope is defiance. Stephen Charleston teaches us that what some people call the founding of a nation was apocalypse for others. Michael Battle teaches us through Ubuntu that I am because we are. Notice something. All of them understand hope not as optimism, but as resistance. Hope is not pretending things are better than they are. Hope is refusing to believe that what is wrong gets to be final. And maybe That is what Black people have always known. When we survived, we have survived because we remembered. We remembered songs. We remembered prayers. We remembered names. We remembered recipes. We remembered scriptures. We remembered Africa, even when America tried to make us forget. We remembered freedom even before we could touch it. That's why memory is so dangerous, because whoever controls memory controls identity. And whoever controls identity controls imagination. Maybe that's why we're fighting over books, curriculum, voting maps, citizenship, monuments, history, because this has never simply been a fight over the past. It's always been a fight over who gets to imagine the future. So on this 4th of July weekend, when people may be flocked to buy fireworks or meat to grill out by the pool, for many of us, this day of celebration has very little to do with the forefathers or the Declaration of Independence. For many of us, this is a day to remember a God who kept us in spite of the enemy's attempt to keep us enslaved. Every 4th of July, I am reminded of a God who would not allow slave traders, slave owners, racists, racism, lawmakers, courts, mobs, myths, or maps to control the narrative of my people. We were not supposed to survive. We were not supposed to read. We were not supposed to vote. We were not supposed to own land. We were not supposed to build institutions. We were not supposed to teach theology. We were not supposed to interpret scripture for ourselves. We were not supposed to remember Africa. We were not supposed to love ourselves. We were not supposed to become free-thinking, educated, spiritually grounded, justice-seeking people. But here we are, still thinking, still praying, still building, still preaching, still marching, still singing, still remembering, still rising. And that's why I do not place my ultimate trust in the Declaration of Independence. I respect it, I study it, I critique it, but I do not worship it. My deeper declaration comes from Genesis 50 and 20. You meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for my good. That's not cheap theology. That's not saying slavery was good. That's not saying oppression was good. That's not saying racism was good. That's saying God is so sovereign that even what evil intended to destroy, God can transform into testimony, survival, wisdom, witness, and liberation. They meant chains. God meant survival. They meant silence. God meant song. They meant illiteracy. God meant scholar. They meant invisibility. God meant prophets. They meant domination. God meant deliverance. They meant evil, but God. And that's the line that keeps saving me. But God, America contradicted itself. But God, the Constitution excluded us. But God, the courts denied us. But God, the laws restricted us. But God, the maps diluted us. But God, the systems targeted us. But God, so what is often forgotten about the freedom of the 4th? It is forgotten that freedom was not evenly distributed. It is forgotten that citizenship had to be fought for. It is forgotten that voting had to be protected. It is forgotten that history had to be preserved. It is forgotten that Black people did not wait passively for liberation. We struggled, we organized, we worshiped, we resisted, we survived. And what is the good of God talk in turbulent times? The good of God talk in that it tells us that we are more than what America called us, more than what the systems did to us, more than the trauma, more than the struggle, more than survival, more than statistics, more than hashtags, more than court cases, more than protest signs, more than political debates, more than image bearers. We are image bearers. We are ancestors' prayers. We are communal memory. We are embodied testimony. We are God's beloved. So today, I do not end in despair. I end in sacred responsibility. Remember rightly, tell the truth, protect the vote, defend citizenship, teach the children, honor the ancestors, build institutions, create community, practice faith that liberates, and never, 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 ever, ever, ever let anyone convince you that critique is the opposite of love. Sometimes critique is love with a backbone. Sometimes lament is love with tears. Sometimes protest is love in motion. Sometimes God talk is the only language strong enough to hold the grief and hope at the same time. So may the God who kept our ancestors keep us. May the God who heard the cries of the enslaved hear the cries of the exhausted. May the God who walked with Israel through wilderness walk with us through uncertainty. May the God who raised Jesus from the dead raise our imagination, our courage, our memory, and our commitment. And may we never confuse fireworks for freedom, because fireworks fade, but freedom requires formation. Freedom requires memory. Freedom requires struggle. Freedom requires truth. My name is Napoleon Bradford. This has been the Native Drums. Keep listening, keep remembering, keep telling the truth, and keep trusting the God who still brings good out of what evil meant for harm. I love you. Have an amazing day. To God be the glory. Goodbye.